Hi, today I'll be talking about reducing bug suffering. By bugs, I mean basically insects, spiders, earthworms, and other kinds of small invertebrates like that. The topic is not often discussed by animal activists. Usually, animal advocates focus more on larger mammals and birds or even fish because they're more human-like and have more cognitive sophistication than bugs do. But I think there are strong reasons to think that bugs in aggregate could matter appreciably to our calculations about how we should act. So the first question that often comes up is, are bugs even conscious? Do they feel pain in a morally relevant way? And there's a lot of literature on insect neurobiology and behavior that's done for reasons other than animal welfare concerns. Insects can be a model organism in neuroscience, and they're small, relatively simple nervous systems, and they don't have as much animal welfare guidelines for laboratory testing. So there are probably hundreds or thousands or more of studies on how insects behave and how their brains work. And so some of the findings are listed here. For example, it's known that insects respond aversively to things like heat, being shocked, being poked in certain situations. When you look at the articles that have been written on whether bugs can feel pain, it's sometimes claimed that bugs don't respond aversively to certain situations, which is true. For example, sometimes an insect can be being eaten and continue feeding without appearing to notice what's going on. But that's not a universal finding. In daily life, when you interact with bugs, you can also see how they respond to input stimuli. I mean, if you shoo a fly, it clearly tries to escape. And so the examples cited in the literature of bugs not seeming to notice certain stimuli don't tell the whole story. There are many, many cases where bugs do clearly react to their environment in all kinds of ways, including sensing different properties of the environment like heat or chemicals and things like that. Another claim that's sometimes made is that insects don't have nociceptors. Nociceptors are the parts of the nervous system that translate mechanical or thermal or other kinds of noxious inputs into pain signals. So for example, there are nociceptors that tell you when something is too hot. And so it was thought that insects didn't possess any nociceptors, but they've been found in at least fruit flies, Drosophila, and it's plausible that they exist in other kinds of insects too. Even without nociceptors, it's clear that insects don't like certain things, and so whether it's that disliking and that reception of negative information is the result of nociceptors or some other functionally similar process, it doesn't seem to matter too much from an ethical standpoint. Another example is that opiates like morphine can modulate the response of certain insects. So here's an example of a paper in which the investigators looked at the escape reaction time of certain crickets. So basically they heated a box and the crickets tried to escape. And so looking at how fast the crickets escaped tells you some indication of how aversive the heat was. And so the paper found that if you added a control to the insects, it didn't change the escape time, but if you add morphine, then they were slower to escape, which suggests that in anthropomorphic terms, we would say that they felt less pain when the heat was present. And of course, you can explain these kinds of results mechanistically. Like it's easy to imagine building a robot that displays this kind of behavior too. But when you add up lots of different behavioral and cognitive traits that are at least simpler forms of what's present in humans, the combination of those things in insects seems to count for something morally, in my view. Insects also display reinforcement learning. So here is an example paper. There are many on this topic. This paper trained fruit flies with positive rewards, and it mentions how you can also do negative rewards with electric shock. insects and other invertebrates display non-rigid behavior at times. So Donald Griffin, in his famous book on animal thinking, talks about how spiders are able to build webs that respond differently to different environmental situations. So it's not as though there's a single web that's always built, but they have to build a different web depending on what kinds of structures are available for the different endpoints of the web and things like that. Bugs can also have social behavior. For example, there's an article, Why Cockroaches Need Their Friends, which talks about studies that have shown that cockroaches raised in isolation behave differently in a systematic way than those raised with others of their species. And bees display pretty impressive cognitive abilities. One example is discussed in this article by Christoph Koch, talking about how bees seem to show cognitive generalization when when forced to make a choice between going in two directions. They can remember the right direction in response to one set of stimuli, and then if they're given a different set of stimuli that are just that display the same sort of sameness or difference property as the original stimuli, they can figure out what the right answer is and continue to make the right choices above chance. So there's still sometimes an issue that's raised, which is even if insects have reasonably sophisticated behavioral traits and can do some of the things that humans can do at a simpler level, it's still not clear that they're conscious. As I mentioned before, it's at least imaginable that you can build a robot, maybe even a not too complicated robot to do each of these things, and in the long term maybe you could get a robot to do all these things, although I think basically all human-built robots today are much simpler and less cognitively powerful than insects, if you think about what insects can do compared with what robots today can do. But still, it seems like you could build a robot to do these things too. So that raises a more fundamental problem, which is what is the difference between a robot and a conscious organism? My own view is that there is actually not a difference, that we humans and animals are also robots that are just very complicated, and we mistake our complexity for being something that's more than mechanical processes. But there's dispute about that question, and so different people may disagree about what should count as conscious. But here I've just listed some quotes that suggest that the issue is open. So even if you think that consciousness is something over and above mechanical operations, you think that consciousness is actually some special extra thing, you should still assign some probability to insects being conscious. In other words, some probability that insects have that special thing. So this slide gives some quotes from Christoph Koch again. He's a neuroscientist at the Allen Institute and is one of the best known neuroscientists in the field. He said, probably what consciousness requires is a sufficiently complicated system with massive feedback, and insects have that. And he also tries to avoid stepping on insects, he said in a recent article on the hard problem of consciousness. And then here's a nice quote from Charles Darwin about how it's amazing that insects have such diversified instincts and mental powers, despite the fact that their cerebral ganglia are not so large as the quarter of a small pin's head. And he suggests that the brain of an ant is perhaps more marvelous than the brain of man. So while words in a scientific paper can be important for enhancing our understanding of insect cognitive abilities, it also helps just to look at some real-world examples, because sometimes the extent of sophistication doesn't come across through written words on paper. So unfortunately, a lot of the material about how insects behave in response to injury is unpleasant and should not have been filmed in the first place, but now that it exists, it provides a useful source of data for us about how insects seem to respond to bad situations. So this is just one example. there are unfortunately a lot online. This video shows the complexity of a bug called the springtail. It used to be considered an insect, but is not anymore. And this shows how the larger female is being butted in the head by males competing for attention as a way to signal their quality as a mate. So the male in the middle eventually wins out. He keeps pressing against the female and she can't get away. And once he knows that he's won, he starts doing twirls to show just how good he is at this. Springtails are extremely numerous. This BBC article shows the size of a springtail and notes that there may be 10,000 per square meter of soil, maybe as many as 200,000. And this one zoologist says that pretty much anywhere on Earth probably has springtails. Next, I'll talk about ways in which humans harm insects. The scale of suffering that humans cause to insects is quite immense. So one of the most salient ways is through silk production. So 10,000 silkworms need to be killed to produce one dress. I'll show a video of that in a second. And they may be killed by boiling or baking or piercing or fumigation or other ways, and many of those sound very painful. Here's a rough cost-effectiveness estimate of trying to reduce silk use in order to reduce silkworm suffering. So in 1997, Italy killed about 42 billion silkworms by its silk consumption or silk imports. And so let's say you tried to lobby people in Italy to produce and consume less silk, and you reduced the amount of silk by just 1%. And say that change only lasted for 5 years into the future. Based on 42 billion silkworms per year, that would save 2,100 worms per dollar if that kind of lobbying campaign cost $1 million to do. So that calculation seems to me fairly conservative, and that's a pretty impressive number. This video shows silkworm cultivation. The silkworm larvae are feeding here on mulberry leaves, and they're actually much bigger than most other insects. So the larvae form pupae that have the silk, but normally the insects would emerge from the silk, and that would destroy the single long strand of the silk fibers. So to prevent that, the silkworm farmers have to boil the pupae alive. And I don't know if the pupae feel pain during this process. You might think that because they're in a protective shell, they don't really need to respond to external events. Maybe their brains are sort of turned off in a similar way as human brains are turned off when we are in non-REM sleep. But there's certainly some chance that they are still able to respond. Even if we can't see them struggling from the outside, maybe they're struggling on the inside of the shell. One reason to think that the larvae at least have some nervous system intact is studies of pupation. For example, this study looked at not silkworms, but another kind of moth, and it found that the later instar of the caterpillars could be trained to associate an electric shock with a specific odor. And then once the larvae became adult moths, they found that the aversion was still present in the adults. So that suggests that some of the neural structure was preserved during pupation. That, of course, that doesn't answer the question of whether the nervous system was active in responding to negative inputs during that process or not. Another way in which humans harm insects is by eating them, and entomophagy, or consumption of insects, is especially common in developing countries. To some extent that's necessary because people don't have other food sources, but it's still a tragedy either way. And insects can be killed in lots of ways before being eaten, but here are just a few of them: boiled, fried, sautéed, steamed, fried, roasted, etc. Here are some unfortunate videos of insects being fried alive, given what we saw before about how painful heat can be for insects. For example, we saw that crickets tried to escape a heated box. This is probably also an extremely bad death. Sometimes people who cook insects freeze them first, and freezing is sometimes thought to be a more humane death than other ways to kill insects, although that's disputed. These particular mealworms were frozen before being fried, but as you can see, they somewhat recover due to the heat, and so freezing did not eliminate the pain of being fried later for them. Sometimes bugs are killed in other ways before eating, such as mechanical destruction or suffocation, which are maybe less bad deaths, but still not pleasant either. And the numbers of insects that are consumed, especially in developing countries, are quite large. But it's a mistake to think that most insect suffering is due to human causes. And in fact, I think the majority of insect suffering is due to natural causes. And maybe that's where our efforts should focus the most. So how big is the problem of insect suffering in the wild? Well, here's a table based on some estimates that I tried to put together. The literature on the number of animals of different groups is not very good. But these are some of the best guesses I put together based on estimates of densities per hectare, multiplying by the number of hectares of a certain land type, or other existing estimates in the literature. A widely cited figure is that there are about 10 to the 18th, or maybe 10 to the 19th insects on Earth. And that's 100 million to 1 billion, roughly, insects for every human. And those numbers are much bigger than even fish or especially other vertebrates. So the stakes are quite high, and even if you care many orders of magnitude less about a single insect than a single fish or bird, the numbers of insects that can be affected by our actions are enormous and might dominate the effects that we can have on bigger animals. Here's one more illustration of just how numerous insects are. So if you look in a tropical rainforest, it's estimated that there are several tons of insects per hectare, compared with a few kilograms of birds and mammals. So even if you weigh the moral importance of an animal merely by its body size, then you would still conclude that insects are in total maybe more important than vertebrates. I also think there are arguments for caring more about insects than their relative body size for a few reasons. One is that smaller animals tend to have bigger brain to body mass ratios, so even for a given amount of total biomass, the brain mass of insects should be bigger than the brain mass of larger animals. And then another reason is that smaller brains may be more efficient, like they may have less redundancy to do the same kinds of operations. They may need less high resolution of detail, but they can still accomplish simpler forms of the same sensory information processing. And an insect is its own little agent that still has its own utility function. And it seems as though that counts for something. So we've seen that there are a lot of insects in the wild, but what are their lives like? Well, unfortunately, many of them have nasty, brutish, and short lives. Even if you look at the adults of many species, they don't survive very long, maybe 2, 3, 6 weeks. Some survive longer, but many die rather quickly. And this means that the pain of death, the pain of dying, is not offset by very much happiness, because there's only so much enjoyment that you can have in a few weeks of life. And unfortunately, the situation is even worse when you consider the young of the species. So here are two bugs that I'll discuss in the next slide. These are survivorship curves from this book, Comparative Ecology. You can see what fraction of the original laid eggs end up hatching and then going through various stages of development. So this is days after the eggs were laid, and you can see that about 90% are dead within 50 days. Since it's a log scale, the number dead within even like 10 days is very high. And likewise, this is the southern green stink bug, and then the sugar cane cicada. These are the larval instars. So you can see about 90% are dead by the second instar or something, between the first and second instar. So based on this, I did some calculations of what fraction of bugs survive to what length of time if you fit a curve to the adult lifespan and the survivorship percentage. And based on that, I calculated that roughly, if you look at one insect year of life for the southern green stink bug, that's equivalent to something like 10 deaths of adult bugs. So what this number means is, if you weigh the sentience of an insect proportionally to its age relative to the adult lifespan, and then you look at how many insects die and multiply each death by the sentience of the insect at the time of death, for this particular species, you get something like 10 adult equivalent deaths per year of the insect's life. So this is a useful way to convert between number of deaths of an insect and an insect year, which is essentially the amount of suffering that a population of size 1 of an insect endures over a year. So that doesn't mean a single insect survives the whole year, but rather it means, say you've got an insect that lives a fourth of a year or something. And so you've got one insect, it dies after a fourth of a year, then it's replaced by one insect that lives another fourth of a year, and so on. That would that process, ignoring the other offspring, would contain 4 deaths, and it would be an insect year in total. There would be 4 lives of 4 insects that live a fourth of a year each. And so this is a metric that I'll use later on to quantify the extent of wild insect suffering. So in general, if you've got a population of some size n, then if the population has that size for a year, then that's n insect years of suffering. So what do the insects die of? This is a helpful table showing mortality for the corn earworm. And you can see, starting with for every 1,000 individuals that you start with, what fraction of them are still alive at what stage of development. And so the survival percentage is about 5% relative to the original total. And they die of predators, parasites, cannibalism, disease, and other causes. This video illustrates the immense numbers of eggs that some insects lay. This is a mayfly laying probably hundreds of eggs here. And you can see that a lot of them hatch as well. It's not as though it lays lots of eggs, but most of those eggs die before they hatch into potentially sentient offspring. Rather, a vast number of the eggs hatch. And in a stable population, all but 2 of those eggs has to die before reproducing, because 2 parents can only produce 2 children who reproduce if the population is to remain stable. So basically all except 2 of these offspring on average will have to die before they become a reproducing adult like this. There are a lot of videos of insect suffering in the wild. Here are just a few of them. This is a praying mantis eating a fly. This is a ladybug eating an aphid. Here's an ant colony being raided by another ant colony. The ants are stealing the honey and dragging out the workers from the rival colony. And when they steal the honey, they sometimes have to chew off the ant that it's attached to. A common reaction at this point is to agree that there's a lot of suffering in nature, but to say that there's nothing humans can do about it. But that's actually not the case, because we affect insects in immense ways in the wild, as well as the insects that we farm and eat. So the most salient way in which we affect insects is by changing habitats and affecting the numbers of insects that can exist. So if we think about a food chain here, primary production, which is the creation of plant biomass and storing of plant energy, is, with a pun intended, the root of wild insect suffering, and actually wild animal suffering more generally, because without plants to eat, animals wouldn't have food, and so there would be fewer of them. When you think about changing higher parts of an ecosystem, like say you removed snakes or something, maybe that would mean more toads, and maybe that would mean more predation of insects, and the complete interactions among the different species are very complex. So it's hard to say exactly what would happen if you modify an environment by affecting certain high-level participants. But if you remove the plants, or at least decrease the plants, then the whole food chain has to be smaller. The number of animals in the food chain has to be smaller, and assuming that food is a limiting factor, which is often the case. So it seems we can at least handle a lot of the complexity of ecosystems if we focus on the root of the issue, which is the primary production. So in the following slides, I'll discuss a few ways in which it seems plausible that humans could reduce insect suffering and expectation, and you'll see that most of these focus on primary production as the key variable of interest when thinking about how to reduce the numbers of wild insects that are born into suffering. So one relatively clear example is gravel lawns. So this is something that's sometimes done for water conservation or to reduce maintenance. People may spend a lot of time mowing and fertilizing their lawns, and so it may be easier to just cover them with gravel, and it's not necessarily aesthetically unpleasant. And so this is something that people do for their own reasons, and it may even be environmentally beneficial in cases where it reduces climate change due to less mowing and less fertilizer and things like that. But it could also be good for insects, because whereas insects live on grass lawns because the grass is a source of energy, there are obviously very few insects on gravel lawns, at least above the ground, and in the long term probably below the ground due to less input of food. So one ballpark estimate is that a typical sized lawn, if you covered it with gravel, you might prevent something like 10 to the 5th or 10 to the 6th insect years per year that it was covered. A main drawback of gravel lawns is that gravel is fairly expensive. So this may not be the highest in terms of cost effectiveness, but if somebody wants to cover their lawn anyway, such as to reduce maintenance burdens or reduce fertilizer or other things, then this could be a good thing to suggest. Another topic is crop cultivation. And so This is very complex because it affects insects in many ways, but one of the most important variables to look at is primary production, as we saw before. So this table from Wikipedia shows ballpark textbook numbers for gross primary productivity of different ecosystem types, and I assume this correlates roughly with net primary productivity, which is the amount available to heterotrophs like insects and other consumers. So as expected, tropical lands have very high production. Temperate forests also are pretty high, and then grasslands and savannas are more intermediate. And then down here is crop fields, just some very general average. And so you can see that crops are maybe comparable to grasslands in production according to these numbers. So if you replace forest with cropland, then it's plausible that in general that's a reduction in primary productivity. Whereas if you replace grassland with crop cultivation, it's less clear what the net impact there is. But insofar as some portion of crops come from former forests or prevent forests from regrowing, that's one reason that crop cultivation could reduce insect populations. Here's a list of a lot of different factors to consider. These are some reasons that crop cultivation might reduce insect suffering. And so the first one is what we already talked about, the possibility of lower primary productivity, although this seems to depend on the type of crop being grown as well as what the land used to be like. Crop cultivation can also reduce soil fertility over time by eroding topsoil. Herbicides might reduce populations of of the plants that are not intended to be grown, and insofar as that reduces plant growth, that might also reduce populations of insects. Crop cultivation can sometimes cause desertification or soil salinization through irrigation, so that can cause the soil to become more salty, and therefore plants grow less well. And eutrophication has an unclear impact, but in general, fertilizers applied to crop fields can lead to or can exacerbate eutrophication. Eutrophication seems to reduce populations of big animals like fish, at least when water bodies become sufficiently anoxic. But because eutrophication also increases plant growth or algae growth, it's not really clear what the net balance of the impact is on wild animal suffering, and that topic deserves further exploration. There are also reasons that crop cultivation could increase insect suffering, and these are important to worry about to some extent. So fertilization allows plants to grow better than they would on natural soil in certain cases. It's said that the Haber process that allows nitrogen fixation from the air may have significantly increased the carrying capacity of the earth by allowing people to grow more total food. Irrigation likewise allows for targeted application of water, which can be a limiting factor for the growth of plants. And certain crops can be very productive, like corn or other grasses, as I'll show. And in general, when you grow crops, the goal is to have high production. So we should expect, especially in industrial countries where growth conditions have been optimized, that the production per hectare should actually be reasonably high, because that's the goal of growing crops. And then there's a possibility that due to disturbance of the land and application of insecticides and things like that, environmental disturbances tend to make animals more R-selected, that is, tend to favor the animals that have high reproductive rates and short lifespans, because they are better able to quickly adapt to changing conditions. And R-selection tends to increase suffering because you've got more infant mortality and more deaths per unit time. So if disturbance increases R-selection, then that could be a bad side effect, although presumably this is the kind of thing that occurs on an evolutionary time scale. And so it's not really clear how much it would have an impact on insects in, say, the next few decades or something. And for a matter of scale on this, it seems plausible that there are between 1 million and maybe 100 million, maybe more bugs per hectare on crop fields, and that's partly based on the estimate of 10 to the 18th bugs in the world divided by the area of the Earth, and it's also based on other estimates of specific insects per hectare on crop fields. So even if we only change the number of insects per hectare by 5% or something through crop cultivation relative to what it would have been, that could be an enormous number in aggregate terms. So there's also a question of whether some crops are better than others. Like, even if we think crop cultivation is good, or even if we think it's bad, maybe some crops are better or less bad than others. And one lens through which to look at this question is to look at primary production again. And it seems that the more productive a crop species is, the more likely it is to allow larger insect populations to live on it, because there's more total food. So this is one comparison. Corn seems to me like a very productive plant in terms of the fact that it can grow very large mass in a single season on a field. Whereas the fava bean is an example of a legume, and it seems much less, there seems to be much less biomass on the field. As another demonstration of the difference in productivity between fava beans and corn, here are some videos showing the time of harvest, which guarantees that the plants are roughly the same age in both pictures. So here's fava beans, and here's corn. It's much taller. This distinction seems to hold more generally if you look at things like wheat and rice. Grasses in general seem to have very high primary productivity, whereas legumes, beans, peanuts, they tend to have lower productivity. So based on that comparison alone, you might naively think that legumes might be better, and that seems plausible to me, although one caveat is that legumes fix nitrogen, which may increase soil productivity. Although, given that people can apply artificial nitrogen fertilizer, it's not clear how much that matters. Another reason to think that denser and more biomass-rich crops could have more suffering is that they have more places to hide for mammals and vertebrates as well. So I've looked at videos of the harvesting of different crop types, and things like oats or other dense crops seem to have sometimes rabbits running away from the machines that are harvesting, whereas I haven't seen any bunnies running out of bean fields or something. So for that reason, I personally try to eat more beans and less wheat or corn in terms of carbohydrates. There are lots of additional variables that need to be considered in a full analysis of legumes versus grasses. For example, it's also relevant to look at the yield per hectare. So let's suppose that crop cultivation of legumes reduces suffering relative to native grassland. Given that legumes may have lower yield per hectare than something like corn, the fact that it requires more total hectares to grow the same amount of human edible food could be an additional bonus for legumes. Of course, if crop cultivation of a given crop type is worse for insects than the native vegetation, then a lower yield would actually be a bad thing, since it would require more hectares of the net negative crop. Another consideration is to look at root biomass, since the figures that I showed on the previous slide and the videos that I've looked at comparing legumes versus grasses only show above ground biomass. And one other consideration is how digestible the different plant types are. So, for example, legumes may in many cases have more digestible leaves and less structure, like less fiber. So even if legumes have lower productivity, maybe the productivity that they do produce is more digestible. Here is a list of my best guesses with some very naive analysis of which foods are probably better and worse. But I think this kind of project should be done more systematically, and we should look at many different factors for assessing the difference in animal suffering between the two. Another activity that plausibly reduces insect suffering is cattle grazing. And this is pretty unpopular among animal advocates because cattle suffer to some extent during the farming process, and especially when slaughtered. They also may be branded or castrated without anesthesia. And so the cattle themselves are worse off due to being born into a life of grazing, but because they eat so much food and so many plants that might otherwise be eaten by smaller organisms, including insects, it seems plausible that they reduce more suffering than they cause. Grazing covers 26% of Earth's ice-free land area, which is an astounding level of impact for one activity. And there are other considerations as well, like climate change, soil erosion, and so on. But at least from the perspective of consuming grass that would otherwise feed animals, cattle grazing seems pretty likely to prevent a lot of suffering. This is especially true when considering grazing in tropical countries like Brazil, shown here. Cattle prevent regrowth of deforested areas, and assuming, as we saw before, that forests have higher productivity than grasslands or pastures, then it seems that preventing regrowth probably reduces insect populations. Another consideration is that forests are often burned and grasslands are often burned as well in the process of making pasture for cattle, and that's very painful to the bugs and other animals that are burned, although it also destroys a lot of plant food that will not be eaten by sentient organisms. As far as Brazilian beef, the amount that's consumed by Western countries is very small. Like the percent of beef consumed in the US that's from Brazil is probably less than 1%, using some recent statistics. But it's at least one factor to consider, and Brazil consumes most of its own beef production, and so in Brazil this would be a much bigger issue to think about. I wrote a piece that tried to combine various factors regarding Brazilian beef production, including climate change, new deforestation, preventing regrowth of forests, and the suffering of the cattle themselves. And this was the result. This is a probability distribution relative to Bayesian probability distributions of input parameters. So, for example, I would say there's some probability distribution for the number of insects and for the fraction by which grazing reduces productivity relative to native land, and a lot of parameters like that, and then combining those uncertain parameters using Monte Carlo sampling, the resulting distribution for the total change in suffering. The total reduction in suffering is what's shown here. So this says that, and this is on a log scale. So this is saying that something like 7 orders of magnitude of insect years are plausibly reduced per kilogram of Brazilian beef purchased. But there's also a reasonable possibility that the impact is harmful on balance to insects and to other animals. And the median of this distribution turns out to be something like 500,000 insect years of suffering prevented per kilogram of beef purchased. One thing that makes this number a little bit smaller than you might think, or than it might have been in the past, is that in 2009 there was a moratorium on new deforestation for cattle production that some major producers agreed to in response to activists and local pressure. And as a result of that, new deforestation has declined substantially in recent years. But even if deforestation went to zero, I think there would still be a significant impact of grazing and also Brazilian crop production because those activities prevent regrowth of forests. Climate change is a big issue because it's relevant to all environmental actions, essentially, like not just the standard issues like driving or using electricity, but as we saw before, beef production, crop cultivation, almost everything we do has some use of energy or otherwise produces CO2, methane, nitrous oxide, etc. emissions. So figuring out climate change is important for figuring out the net impact of a lot of other environmental changes that humans have. And it's also a very big issue in its own right because it has the potential to significantly impact animal populations worldwide. And there's also some possibility that, especially if human civilization stagnates for long periods, or if humans even go extinct, that climate change could continue having repercussions for thousands or even millions of years into the future. And there are very few other environmental changes that humans have that predictably have the same extent of very long-term impacts. For example, if you pave over some area, probably in hundreds or thousands of years, I'm guessing, the pavement will be broken up and then eventually plants can come back through. Likewise, if you eliminate a forest, eventually the forest will return. But with climate change, the impacts could be very long. And so at least in the unlikely scenarios where the biosphere remains for thousands or millions of years into the future, climate change could make a big impact there. One tricky issue, though, is that it seems very difficult to pin down the net impact of climate change on wild animals because there are so many conflicting impacts in different directions, and this page highlights a few of them. So there are some studies suggesting that climate change may reduce phytoplankton productivity, although other studies sometimes suggest increases in primary productivity of phytoplankton. It seems the consensus is more toward reduction of phytoplankton, but that's not settled by any means. And a similar story applies to zooplankton, which feed on phytoplankton. Climate change may cause desertification in many areas. The ocean acidification that results from carbon emissions is destroying coral reefs. Ocean acidification is a close twin of climate change. It's not strictly about climate, but it results from carbon emissions as well. Warmer temperatures may reduce dissolved oxygen in water bodies, and dissolved oxygen can be a limiting factor for the growth of animals in some cases. And at least in the extreme warming scenarios, there are predictions about mass extinctions which could affect even lower level animals, not just the bigger vertebrates that we're familiar with. So people sometimes say things like climate change may cause 50% of species to go extinct or things like that. And that's relevant, but it doesn't give us enough information to tell what the impact on total wild animal suffering is, because if a species goes extinct, it may be replaced by other species. And indeed, if big animals go extinct, maybe the more hardy small animals like insects will remain. But there have been historical cases in the geologic past when significant enough changes to Earth caused extinctions even of insects. And in that case, it seems more plausible that total wild animal populations would decline. But there's high uncertainty, and it's worth exploring those kinds of things further. And on the reverse side, climate change can also increase wild animals in a number of ways. So, for example, climate change may increase plant growth because plants sometimes grow better with higher carbon dioxide. Higher CO2 concentrations can reduce the less efficient process of photorespiration. In response to climate change, one action that people sometimes take is to try to preserve the rainforest or other forests or other natural carbon sinks in order to sequester carbon from the atmosphere. And so that pressure for increasing rainforest preservation will probably increase total suffering because rainforests are home to many insects. Likewise, people have proposed geoengineering solutions such as fertilizing the oceans to increase production of phytoplankton, and the net impact of that is not clear, but if we follow the heuristic that more primary production generally means more animals, then that could be a bad thing. And then there are other ways that climate change could increase suffering apart from changing animal populations, such as causing there to be more generations per year of an insect. So in the tropics, insects may have many generations per year, whereas in higher latitudes, insects tend to be killed in the winter, and so they can only grow during so many months of the year and have fewer generations per year. So more generations per year means more deaths per year and hence more suffering. It's also suggested that warmer temperatures might decrease animal body sizes, which may mean more total animals, even if the amount of biomass stays constant. And one speculative possibility is that if climate change lasts long enough, then it could delay a future ice age. And in the past, ice ages have obviously reduced the amount of animals in higher latitudes and also reduced primary production in the tropics. So that could be a pretty significant impact. As we've seen, there are a lot of factors to consider when thinking about the net impact of climate change, and the overall balance is very uncertain, but the potential impact is also very high. So what this table does is give an estimate for what kind of change in insect years of suffering might result if we assume that climate change tends to reduce insect populations, and then this column says if climate change probably on balance increases insect populations. Here's a relatively high guess about the change in insect years that would result from CO2 emissions. So this table shows for various kinds of CO2 emissions what kind of change in insect years is plausible in terms of a low and a high estimate. So given the parameters that I plugged in here, it's almost symmetric about 0, but we can see what kinds of magnitudes may be at stake. Here's a rather astonishing number that for a round-trip flight between the two sides of the United States, which uses 2.5 metric tons of CO2, which releases that many metric tons of CO2, it may cause something on the order of 10 million insect years, either to be prevented or to be created. So there seems to be a lot of value in better researching this topic and figuring out whether we can break the symmetry between the positives and negatives here. There is a reason for hope on the issue of wild insect suffering, as this series of pictures shows. So this is from a paper, Deforestation in the Anthropocene, and it talks about reductions in vertebrate and invertebrate populations due to human activity. So there's a lot of noise for any given environmental intervention, but if we look at the aggregate of what humans have done so far, it seems as though they've reduced both the vertebrate and invertebrate populations on balance. There may be some methodology problems with using these results at face value, but combined with the fact that humans appropriate a lot of net primary productivity from the biosphere and reduce habitat and things like that, it seems quite plausible that the aggregate of human activity reduces insect populations. So you can see different graphs here. This one shows that many more insect types are decreasing than increasing, decreasing is red, increasing is green. Many insect types have between 0 and 40% decreases over the last 40 years. This graph shows an index of abundance for butterflies and moths and all other invertebrates. And the average decline of the combined index is about 45% in the past 40 years. And then this graph shows that there tends to be lower diversity of Lepidoptera in disturbed areas, although diversity does not imply abundance, and abundance is really what matters for net suffering. But there tends to be a relationship between diversity and abundance, so this may tell us something too. This next slide shows some very rough estimates of the cost effectiveness of different ways of reducing insect suffering, and unfortunately most of these are not something you can spend money on right now, but they're suggestions about what kinds of campaigns might be good to set up, and a lot more work needs to be done to refine these estimates, and they could be off by orders of magnitude, but this is a first pass attempt to come up with some concreteness as far as how to compare these different possibilities. So we saw before that Brazilian beef production probably reduces primary productivity significantly. So if one were to hypothetically buy beef from Brazil itself, it's plausible that it would prevent on the order of 1 million insect years per dollar spent. Eliminating human biting mosquitoes, such as using gene drives, which is an upcoming technology to spread genes throughout a population, could have a significant impact on insect suffering as well. You might think it's mainly because of preventing mosquito populations, but I think the much bigger impact is actually by increasing the human population due to fewer deaths from malaria or other insect-borne diseases. And this relates to what we saw in the last slide, that humans on average seem to reduce net insect suffering, and assuming the same is true for people in developing countries where malaria and other diseases are most prevalent, then reducing deaths from those diseases could significantly reduce insect suffering. Although there's a lot of uncertainty, which is why I put a question mark here, because some people suggest that declining infant mortality might actually reduce population, because now parents don't have to have as many kids to make sure they have surviving kids. And there's also uncertainty in my mind about the net impact of increasing wealth in the developing world, because it does seem to be a trend that industrial countries have much bigger environmental impact than developing countries, but there are also many ways in which those in the developing world have significant environmental impacts, such as slash and burn agriculture, using firewood for heating, and many ways in which people are improving processes like crop cultivation through indoor farms or in vitro meat. Many kind of technological innovations actually may reduce humans' environmental impact. So the net impact of, say, economic growth or poverty reduction is not obvious, but it does seem plausible that at least saving lives, maybe in expectation, reduces insect suffering, although that topic deserves further research, especially because it's a socially acceptable way to reduce insect suffering. I've got this other column here. Is the intervention socially acceptable relative to, say, other animal advocates' values, and especially the general public's values? And so buying beef from Brazil is probably widely considered a bad thing to do, whereas eliminating mosquitoes, especially if that prevents 1 million deaths per year from insect-borne diseases, that's a widely applauded action, even though it also increases environmental destruction. So finding kind of win-win actions like this could be a very good target, and we should explore more whether reducing poverty and especially reducing disease in the third world could be a win for both humans and insects, or the insects that will not be born into lives of suffering. As we saw before, climate change is very uncertain, but it's plausible that energy efficiency or other kinds of technological work in the energy and climate arenas could have pretty big impacts, but further research needs to be done to figure out whether they're good or bad for insects. If you were to hypothetically cover rainforest land, that would prevent significant insect suffering. It's a more clearly positive thing than rainforest beef production, which also involves burning and still allows for lots of insects to live on the pasture fields and things. But it's plausible that grazing is just a very efficient way to eliminate biomass compared with trying to fully cover ground with some other material. But there's a lot of noise in these estimates. I mentioned that reducing deaths from malaria might be a good intervention. So relative to high uncertainty, it's possible that a dollar donated to the Against Malaria Foundation prevents on the order of 20,000 insect years of suffering. And this is also something that people can do today, so it might be a good short-term outlet for people who want to do something concrete. Campaigning against use of silk, as we saw, this is using the numbers for a campaign to reduce Italy's silk imports. And then gravel lawns, this is based on a relatively conservative estimate of how expensive it would be to convince a person to put a gravel lawn on his or her yard. And this can be socially acceptable in cases where gravel lawns would reduce water use or mowing and things like that. Next, here are some considerations for a movement to reduce insect suffering. I think it would be good to have an organization that promotes concern for the suffering of bugs in nature and at human hands. But there are some concerns that I think would need to be kept in mind. The most significant is the possibility that simple promotion of concern for insects could actually encourage habitat conservation. So if you think about things like telling people that insect lives are important, that insects have emotions, and especially emphasizing the ways in which humans harm insects, if you only talked about those things, then people might assume that humans are the cause of problems and insects enjoy their lives, and therefore we should try to preserve habitat as much as possible for insects. And this is not a insect welfare organization, but it is a charity that works with insect issues, and one of their projects is to preserve habitats for invertebrates. And one example of a project that this organization promotes is making buildings have green roofs so that more insects can be supported in urban areas. And so this is an exactly wrong outcome of efforts to promote concern for insect suffering. Like this would cause the opposite of what we want to happen. So it's very important to emphasize the net negative nature of insect lives, especially if you take a pessimistic view about the badness of suffering relative to other values. Another possibility is that promoting concern for insects might lead to reduced insecticide use. It might lead people to think, since insecticides kill insects and probably in painful ways, that we should reduce insecticide use. Whereas I think this is actually a very complex question with a non-obvious answer. Insecticides seem to dramatically reduce insect populations on crop fields, and insofar as they do that, they may reduce long-term insect populations and may reduce many more natural deaths that would have occurred otherwise. And then one more concern is that talking about entomophagy might make it more salient in people's minds. So right now, very few people are interested in eating insects in the West, and making the idea more well known might tend to increase the variance in people's attitudes. So even if you're opposing entomophagy, there might be some percentage of people who hear the message and don't agree with your arguments, but are still inclined toward looking into the issue more. And so any increase in variance in the Western population's attitudes towards entomophagy seems like it's more likely to increase net insect consumption. Here's one anecdote regarding the potential risks of talking about entomophagy. In 2014, I did an interview with Vox, the online website, talking about the possibility that video game non-player characters might deserve a non-zero degree of ethical importance. And I also talked about insects in that interview and mentioned how the spread of entomophagy would probably be bad because it would increase the number of insects that exist and that are painfully killed. Then 1 week later, Vox had an article, 6 Reasons to Consider Eating Insects. And I don't know if this was influenced by what I had mentioned the week before, but it was an interesting juxtaposition. A final consideration is that we should also think about the far future in our calculations and prioritization. The reason is that while Earth contains a large number of insects, the number of sentient creatures that might be created in the galaxy or many accessible galaxies as a whole could be much larger. So in his paper Astronomical Waste, Nick Bostrom uses roughly these numbers, although I made up a few of them, to illustrate the potential importance of the amount of sentience that could exist if space were colonized. So say there are about 10 to the 13th accessible stars, and assume that using nanotechnology and advanced robotics and so on, we could get 10 to the 42 computational operations per second from each star. And then if we assume a human brain takes about 10 to the 17th operations per second, and this is my number here, a human brain has about 10 to the 6th times as many neurons as an insect brain. So if we roughly assume that an insect brain, you can compute roughly 1 million insects per human over a given time period, and then if we say that stars will last another 10 billion years, which is a very conservative number, multiplying all those things out would give a very big number of potential insect years that could be simulated if the entire Virgo supercluster were used to simulate insects. I multiply by 10 to the negative 10th here as an anthropic discount, and what this means is it seems very strange that we would be in a special position to influence so many minds in the far future. And so from a Copernican or mediocritarian perspective where we should be typical observers, that seems like a very strange situation for us to be in. And more generally, extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence, and it's not at all certain that this kind of colonization process is likely to happen or that we can appreciably influence it. But given the size of these numbers, even if you multiply by a pretty small discount, you still get a big number in the end. And so this is sort of a number of how many insect years could be simulated if all the computing resources were used for insects. But fortunately, not all, or probably not many, of computing resources in the future will be used to compute insect minds. But it's possible that a not too small fraction could be used on simulating sentient creatures like insects. For example, imagine that the intelligence that's colonizing our part of the universe wants to study the evolution of life on other planets, and so it runs a lot of simulations of life developing and then ecosystems on other planets to see whether intelligent life emerges there. Or maybe the civilization wants to study the animals of the past for scientific or other forms of curiosity. Maybe the members of the civilization have intrinsic value on, say, simulating nature or creating video game worlds or virtual realities that contain lifelike creatures. And in order to simulate a very realistic animal, it seems plausible that you need to implement many of the animal's cognitive algorithms. And in general, intelligent computation may have its own ethical weight, whether it looks like insects or whether it's more abstract, because intelligent computation, like insects and other animals, is a complex collection of processes that are trying to accomplish some goal and for which things can be better or worse. We might give less weight to abstract computations than to very animal-like, very emotional processes. But even if we only care a little bit about the less animal-like and more abstract computations, the total number could be quite significant. So we should keep the far future in mind when picking what to work on, and it seems as though promoting concern for suffering is a relatively robust way to help to reduce the negative potential consequences of the expansion of intelligence into the galaxy. But it also seems reasonable to focus on short-term impacts as well, because we have more confidence in them, and the causal chains are just much less distant, whereas with the far future, there's a lot of entropy between what we do now and what the ultimate effects will be. So where do we go from here? We've seen that there are enormous numbers of insects, both cultivated by humans and especially in the wild, and insects probably have pretty bad lives on the whole. And so ways forward include researching how different environmental policies affect insect suffering. I sketched a few examples of that here, but there's much more work to be done to refine and increase certainty in those kinds of conclusions. When we promote concern for insects, it's important to emphasize that wild insects probably don't have good lives on the whole, because if we don't make that a salient point of our discussion, then people may inaccurately conclude that we want to preserve wild insects, which could actually backfire and cause more harm than good. Likewise, it's important to challenge environmentalist assumptions about the notion that what happens in nature is good. And finally, we need to keep in mind the potential to multiply insect suffering by spreading wildlife habitats into space, especially in simulations, and not just considering insects per se, but also insect-like algorithms that may emerge in the future. Thanks for listening, and let me know if you have comments or would like to get more involved.